Have you ever noticed that some people seem to know what's coming before everyone else? Not because they have a crystal ball, not because they're lucky, and definitely not because they can see the future. Yet somehow, they spot trends early. They avoid mistakes before they happen. They position themselves ahead of major changes while everyone else is still trying to understand what's going on. So what's their secret? Pattern recognition. The ability to identify recurring signals hidden inside what looks like chaos. And once you understand how pattern recognition works, you'll start seeing opportunities, risks, and future outcomes that most people completely miss. Think about it. Every major event in history looked unpredictable until it happened. A market crash, a technological revolution, a social movement, a company's collapse, a celebrity's rise, a political shift. After the event occurs, people say the signs were obvious. But why didn't they see them before? Because most people focus on events. Predictors focus on patterns. And that's the difference. Imagine you're driving on a highway. You don't wait until the car in front of you slams on the brakes before reacting. You notice subtle changes. Traffic density increases. Cars begin slowing slightly. Drivers start switching lanes. Tiny signals appear before the major event. The future often works exactly the same way. Large outcomes are usually preceded by small clues. The problem is that most people are distracted by noise. They react to headlines, they react to emotions, they react to whatever is trending today. But patterns reveal themselves only to those who pay attention over time. Let's start with a simple example. Netflix wasn't always the giant it is today. Years before streaming became dominant, there were signals everywhere. Internet speeds were improving. Consumers wanted convenience. Physical media was becoming less relevant. People were spending more time online. Each signal alone meant very little. Together they formed a pattern, and that pattern pointed toward a future where streaming would replace traditional rental stores. The same thing happened with social media. The same thing happened with artificial intelligence. The future rarely arrives without warning. It whispers before it shouts. The question is whether you're listening. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that prediction requires certainty. It doesn't. Professional investors don't predict the future with 100% accuracy. Neither do military strategists. Neither do business leaders. What they do is recognize probabilities. They understand that patterns increase the likelihood of certain outcomes. Imagine flipping a coin. One flip tells you almost nothing. 1,000 flips reveal a pattern. The more observations you collect, the clearer the signal becomes. Life operates similarly. The more data points you observe, the easier it becomes to recognize recurring structures. And here's where things get interesting. Human behavior is one of the most predictable forces on Earth. People change, technology changes, cultures evolve, but human psychology remains surprisingly consistent. Fear, greed, status, belonging, security. These motivations have shaped human decisions for thousands of years. When you understand these drivers, predicting behavior becomes dramatically easier. Take financial bubbles as an example. Every bubble looks different on the surface. Different assets, different technologies, different stories. But underneath, the same psychological pattern repeats. Excitement, optimism, euphoria, overconfidence, denial, panic, collapse. Again and again, generation after generation, different actors, same script. This is why studying history is one of the most powerful prediction tools available. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes constantly. When you examine enough historical examples, you begin noticing recurring structures. Economic cycles, political cycles, technological cycles, cultural cycles. The names change, the patterns remain. Consider the rise and fall of dominant technologies. At first, a new technology is ignored, then mocked, then criticized, then suddenly adopted. Then it becomes normal. Then it becomes essential. This pattern has repeated with electricity, automobiles, the internet, smartphones, and AI. Once you recognize the cycle, you stop asking whether adoption will happen. You start asking how far along the cycle we already are. And that question gives you a significant advantage. Another critical skill is distinguishing between signals and noise. Most information is noise. Most headlines are noise. Most social media debates are noise. Noise is attention-grabbing but temporary. Signals are subtle but persistent. Imagine hearing a single rumor. That's noise. Now imagine hearing the same information from independent sources over several months. That's potentially a signal. The strongest predictors don't chase every new piece of information. They look for recurring evidence, repeated observations, consistent trends, patterns that refuse to disappear. That's where the real insights live. There's a fascinating story about chess grandmasters. Researchers discovered that elite players weren't necessarily calculating more moves than beginners. Instead, they recognized patterns faster. They had seen similar board positions thousands of times before. Their brains could instantly identify structures that inexperienced players couldn't see. What looked like intuition was actually pattern recognition. And the same principle applies to life. Experts often appear psychic. They're not. They're simply recognizing familiar patterns faster than everyone else. Shifts before competitors. A skilled recruiter identifies talent before others do. An experienced doctor notices symptoms that less experienced professionals overlook. Their advantage isn't magic. It's accumulated pattern recognition. The good news? Anyone can develop this skill. You don't need a genius IQ. You don't need special gifts. You need observation, curiosity, and consistency. Start paying attention to cause and effect. Whenever something significant happens, ask yourself a question. What happened before this? Not immediately before, months before, years before. What signals were visible? What indicators were ignored? What clues existed that now seem obvious? This simple habit can transform how you think. Instead of seeing isolated events, you'll start seeing chains of events, connections, sequences, patterns. And once you start noticing patterns, you begin anticipating outcomes. Let's talk about another powerful concept: convergence. A single trend can be misleading. Multiple trends moving in the same direction are much harder to ignore. Imagine seeing growth in artificial intelligence. Interesting. Now combine that with increasing computing power, massive data generation, corporate investment, government interest, consumer adoption. Suddenly you're no longer looking at one trend, you're looking at convergence. Several independent forces pointing toward the same future. Convergence often produces the strongest predictions, because multiple signals reinforce one another. Think of it like weather forecasting. One dark cloud doesn't guarantee a storm, but dark clouds, falling pressure, rising humidity, and strong winds together create a much stronger case. The same logic applies to predicting future events. The more independent signals align, the higher the probability of a particular outcome. There's a trap you must avoid: confirmation bias. This is where many people fail. Once they develop a prediction, they begin looking only for information that supports it. They ignore contradictory evidence, and eventually they become blind to reality. True pattern recognition requires intellectual honesty. You must constantly challenge your assumptions. Ask yourself, what evidence would prove me wrong? What am I missing? Which signals contradict my current belief? The best predictors aren't attached to being right. They're attached to discovering what's true. And that mindset makes all the difference. There's another reason pattern recognition is becoming more valuable than ever. The world is accelerating. Technology evolves faster. Information spreads faster. Industries transform faster. The ability to recognize emerging patterns before they become obvious creates enormous advantages. Opportunities often belong to those who arrive early. Not first, but early. Early enough to act before the crowd. Think about people who recognized the importance of the internet in the 1990s, or smartphones in the 2000s, or digital content creation in the 2010s. The clues existed long before mass adoption occurred. The future left footprints. Some people noticed, most didn't. So how can you start building this skill today? First, consume information across multiple fields. Innovation often emerges where different domains intersect. Study technology, psychology, business, history, science, culture. The broader your knowledge base, the more patterns you'll recognize. Second, keep a prediction journal. Write down observations, document trends, record expectations, then revisit them months later. This practice trains your brain to think probabilistically, rather than emotionally. Third, study outcomes. Whenever something major happens, investigate the lead-up. Look for the signals that existed beforehand. Train yourself to identify recurring structures. Fourth, focus on long-term developments rather than daily noise. The future is usually shaped by trends that unfold gradually. Most people ignore them because they seem boring at first, but those slow-moving changes often become the biggest transformations. And finally, practice patience. Pattern recognition isn't about making dramatic predictions every day. It's about gradually improving your ability to see what's likely to happen next. Small improvements compound over time, just like investing, just like learning, just like success itself. Here's the reality. The future will never be perfectly predictable. Unexpected events will always exist. Surprises will always happen. But uncertainty doesn't mean randomness. Beneath the surface chaos, patterns are constantly forming. Signals are constantly emerging. Clues are constantly appearing. The people who learn to recognize them gain a remarkable advantage. Not because they can see the future, but because they understand the present more deeply than everyone else. And that's the ultimate secret. Future events are usually hidden inside current patterns. The next breakthrough, the next opportunity, the next disruption, the next crisis. The signs often exist long before the outcome becomes obvious. Most people see the event. A few people see the pattern. And those who see the pattern first often shape the future instead of reacting to it. So starting today, pay closer attention. Look beyond headlines. Look beyond opinions. Look beyond temporary distractions. Search for recurring signals. Observe human behavior. Study history. Follow long-term trends, and ask yourself one simple question every day. What pattern is forming right now that everyone else is ignoring? Because the answer to that question might reveal tomorrow, long before it arrives. And once you learn to recognize those patterns, you'll never look at the world the same way again.